Was the French and Indian War a grand clash of empires, or the predictable result of a simple geographic problem? The conflict's flashpoint was the Ohio Valley, a strategic bottleneck that held two opposing futures for North America. For the one, 5 million British colonists pressed against the Appalachian Mountains, this valley was the only viable gateway for westward expansion, driven by an insatiable hunger for agricultural land. For the French, whose 75,000 settlers were spread thinly from Canada to Louisiana, the same valley was the critical land bridge holding their vast, trade-based empire together. This geography exposed two fundamentally incompatible expansionist models. The British model was a slow, dense, demographic wave of settlement. The French model was a tenuous corridor of forts and trade alliances, designed to control territory without populating it. The French chain of forts, intended as a barrier, was effectively a brittle fence against a demographic flood. Diplomacy was secondary. The core conflict was a physical inevitability, driven by the relentless pressure of British colonization. A collision wasn't a matter of if, but when and where, and the forks of the Ohio River were the designated ground zero. If numerical superiority and logistical dominance dictate the outcome of a campaign, how did the most professional military force on earth march into the Pennsylvania woods in 1755 and get systematically dismantled by an enemy half its size? The answer lies in the fatal friction between institutional doctrine and environmental reality. In July 1755, Major General Edward Braddock led a massive British expedition to capture Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River. British military command operated on a strict paradigm of European warfare: open fields, disciplined linear formations, and platoon volley fire. While historians note Braddock was a capable administrator who tried to prepare his men, he remained bound by a tactical playbook the North American geography simply would not support. The expedition faced an immediate logistical bottleneck. Hauling heavy artillery through dense forests slowed the advance to a crawl. Seeking a solution, Braddock accepted the tactical advice of a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer, George Washington. Washington suggested a critical trade-off: split the force, leave the cumbersome baggage train behind, and push forward rapidly with a flying column. While this solved the speed problem, it fractured the army's defensive mass and stretched their lines dangerously thin. On July 9, this vanguard collided with a mixed force of French and indigenous fighters near the Monongahela River. What followed was a mechanical failure of British doctrine. As the French and indigenous forces dispersed into the surrounding ravines, the British infantry instinctively closed ranks. They attempted to deliver disciplined volleys into the forest, a tactic designed to break massed infantry, not scattered marksmen. The dense canopy absorbed the musket balls, while the clustered British soldiers provided perfect targets. Stripped of the ability to execute a coordinated bayonet charge, the command structure collapsed under invisible fire. The defeat at the Monongahela was absolute. Braddock was mortally wounded, and his shattered column was forced into a chaotic retreat. The psychological and military consequences were profound. Evidence suggests this disaster shattered the myth of British invincibility among their colonial subjects. It proved that rigid adherence to conventional European formations was a death sentence on the frontier, forcing a painful, systemic re-evaluation of how the empire would have to fight to hold the continent. If a military force cannot see its target, how does it project power? The slaughter of 1755 provided a brutal field test, inverting the expectation that disciplined European infantry could simply march over colonial resistance. The British Army quickly realized that surviving the North American frontier required a fundamental shift in doctrine, trading the rigid geometry of the battlefield for the fluid mechanics of irregular warfare. During the late 1750s, this tactical pivot generated intense institutional friction between British regulars and American provincials. Popular mythology often frames this as a clash between wooden-headed British aristocrats and naturally gifted American frontiersmen, but historians suggest a more complex reality. While British troops initially lacked experience in forest combat, They were highly disciplined and structurally adaptable. Conversely, many American provincials were coastal townsfolk with no more wilderness experience than a London baker, and their poor camp hygiene made them highly susceptible to disease. The British command needed troops who could fight in the forest on the flanks of the main army, but they also required soldiers who would not abandon their posts when conditions deteriorated. The strategic necessity of intelligence gathering ultimately forced a compromise. Traditional line infantry could not effectively scout dense terrain, secure flanks, or harass enemy supply lines. To fill this void, specialized light infantry and ranger units emerged. The most prominent innovator was a New Hampshire provincial named Robert Rogers. By 1757, Rogers had codified a new doctrine of guerrilla warfare in his Rules of Ranging. According to military historians, these standing orders transformed chaotic skirmishing into a systematic methodology. Rogers mandated marching in single file to minimize target profiles, utilizing constant flank security, and establishing strict protocols for ambushes and retreats. The primary value of these rangers was not in holding territory, but in generating actionable intelligence and projecting psychological pressure deep into French-held terrain. However, the British command remained deeply skeptical of provincial discipline. As a strategic trade-off, the British military began absorbing these tactical innovations directly into their own ranks. By training regular soldiers as dedicated light infantry, the British fused the survival mechanics of the American Ranger with the operational reliability of the European professional, setting the stage for the decisive campaigns to come. By 1759, British tactical adaptations had proven effective, but the ultimate objective, Quebec, remained a strategic puzzle. The city was a fortress perched atop a cliff, its primary defense not just its walls, but the treacherous St. Lawrence River. The French command operated under the assumption that no major naval force could navigate the river's dangerous shoals and currents. This assumption was proven fatally wrong. In a masterful display of logistical power, the Royal Navy, guided by navigators like a young James Cook, threaded a fleet carrying 500 soldiers up the river, effectively nullifying Quebec's geographic isolation and placing an army at its doorstep. For months, British General James Wolfe probed the city's defences with no success. Frustrated, and with his health failing, he made a final, high-risk gamble. On the night of September 13th, Wolfe's light infantry scaled the cliffs at Anse-au-Foulon, a poorly guarded landing spot, securing a foothold for his army on the Plains of Abraham. By dawn, the British were deployed for battle, but their position was incredibly precarious. They were a small force, with no line of retreat, facing the main French army in Quebec and another French detachment to their rear. Defeat meant annihilation. This is where the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, made a critical tactical error. Instead of containing Wolfe's force and waiting a few hours to coordinate a crushing attack with his other troops, Montcalm panicked. Evidence suggests he feared the British would entrench and sever his supply lines. He hastily assembled his army, a mix of professional regulars and less reliable militia, and charged. The British regulars, trained for superior firepower, stood their ground and shattered the French assault with disciplined volleys. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded, but the battle's outcome was decided. Montcalm's premature engagement threw away a decisive strategic advantage, and with his defeat, the French hold on North America was broken. The ultimate irony of the war is that British victory guaranteed the loss of its American colonies. By expelling France, Britain removed the one external threat that kept the colonists dependent on its protection, exposing the deep fractures in the Anglo-American relationship over authority and cost. Men like George Washington, once treated as subordinate provincial pawns, emerged from the conflict as seasoned military leaders. They had learned from British professionals how to fight a war, experience they would soon turn against their former commanders. Britain won a continent, only to create the conditions for its own expulsion.